Hello, this is Christine Price, and you are listening to Nutritional Neurochemistry, recorded on June 5th, 2013. I'm excited to do this class. It's been a while since I've done this one, and I started putting this together, and it exhausted me. I realized, oh my gosh, this is so much, and it's so intellectual. So I decided I had to find some jokes to lighten it up. So here's a teacher joke. Sarcastic teacher says, "If there's any idiots in the room, will they please stand up?" And after a long silence, one college freshman rose to his feet. Teacher says, "Now then, mister, why do you consider yourself an idiot?" inquired the teacher with a sneer. "Well, actually, I don't," said the student, "but I hate to see you standing up there all by yourself." So that's why I'm sitting. All right. But we're going to talk a little bit about the different neurochemicals. So we make these neurochemicals in our brains out of amino acids, and those are found in proteins and other foods. And for every substance that we hear about or use or abuse or notice that people are using and abusing, there is a genuine article made by the brain. The brain actually will create something real. So the mind-altering chemicals are the counterfeits, and they are trying to mimic our natural neurochemicals. So I worked as a substance abuse counselor in the 90s, and so that was my first career. I learned a lot about these mechanisms, this biochemistry that goes on in our brains, and how powerful it is to balance that, and why that's a trigger, why people end up self-medicating a lot of times. And then in the self-medication, they obviously are throwing off the balance in their system, and it really is a delicate balance. And so when we work with it as a delicate balance, we can heal it. All right, so we're going to start with this neural network in the brain and think about the nerve cells. So if you think about a nerve cell, it's kind of like I'm holding a hand out with my fingers all extended, and these fingers represent the dendrites, and then I hold my other hand up next to it, and I hold it in a fist, and what you see with the fist is it's like that is the receptor. Okay, so these dendrites come out, and then there's a receptor from the next nerve cell. And so if we were to continue, then that nerve cell would look like this. There would be another dendrite, and it would just kind of continue on with all these connections. But you notice there's a space in between, and that space in between is important. They don't touch, okay? So if you think about what is it that is communicating between these nerve cells, it's kind of like electricity, kind of like a telephone, if you think of it that way. In fact, if you think of it like a telephone, you've got the transmitter where you talk into, and you've got the receiver. So the transmitter is the fingers coming out. The receiver is the fist receiving the information, the communication. Okay, but what is it that's going between the two? Does anybody know? That is called the synapse, the empty space. It's chemicals. So it's a chemical communication is what it is. So a chemical has to leave the fingers, go into the synapse, and be picked up by the receiver. So that's how our whole body communicates, is through chemicals, more or less. Neurochemicals is what they are. So there's 5 critical neurochemicals. Well, there's a ton. In fact, I started looking at that, and there's dozens of peptides and different neurochemicals, but we're going to talk about 5 of them. Norepinephrine is the stimulant chemical. So it's mimicked, or the counterfeits are caffeine or any stimulants out there, so energy drinks, all the way at the end of the line probably is methamphetamine. That would be a stimulant, and that mimics norepinephrine. And we're going to talk about what you can replace that with, or how you can support that delicate balance in the brain. Because what happens when you drink caffeine? You get a boost, right? Your energy comes up. But then does it stay there, and is that a healthy balance? No, you crash, or you depend on more to get your system to come back up that high. So that's kind of the problem with using those counterfeits. And so what we want to do is find natural resources. But first of all, just notice what you tend to crave, because that's going to give you an indication of what chemicals are maybe in low supply in your system. So GABA is another neurochemical, and that's the other end of the spectrum, so it's a depressant. And the things that mimic that are sleeping pills. And so those are things like Xanax and Valium. Benzodiazepines are the other depressants. And so is alcohol. When people drink lightly or, just have that drink, it relaxes them is the idea with the alcohol. We'll go on to serotonin. Serotonin is kind of more of a mood stabilizer. It keeps you in the even keel. Whereas norepinephrine brings you up, GABA brings you down, serotonin keeps you just kind of in the even center. The things that people will use to increase that level are a lot of times foods, like comfort foods. So starches and carbs, right? They give you that kind of that content sort of feeling. And then SSRIs are the antidepressants that are trying to increase the serotonin that flows. It stays in the synapse. So what SSRI stands for is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it prevents the serotonin from being recycled, so it sits in the synapse between. So it's hanging out longer. Then we have beta endorphins, and those are the pain relief chemicals. They also induce euphoria. So when you have so if you think about, some of us do like pain pills, and they just, for me, I really liked them. I knew that was the one thing I couldn't get into. So, and sugar is the other thing. It's kind of like a natural narcotic in our food. Okay. So you get that kind of sugar buzz or sugar high. And that's sort of that euphoria kind of feeling. And then we'll talk more. Oh, and then of course, if you move into the extreme, endorphin actually stands for inner morphine. So that's kind of where you get that word. The orphan, it's like orphine, and endo is inner. Things like heroin and stuff, they mimic the beta endorphins and then take the body way out of balance. Sometimes looking at the opposite of that helps you know if you're low. And pain is an indication that your endorphins are not kicking in. Emotional pain as well as physical pain. And then the dopamine is kind of a combination between a stimulant and an endorphin. So it's kind of combining both. And so examples of that, chocolate is one. So it gives you kind of that numbing effect kind of, or that sort of sugar buzz, along with a boost, like a stimulant boost. And cocaine is the drug that would mimic that. And the other thing that happens with dopamine is people tend to want to get into fantasy pleasure type addictions, where they kind of check out of reality plus get a rush. So anything that does that is probably raising the dopamine levels. Examples are, they found gambling increases endorphin or the dopamine, like when people win, and sex is another one. I would think pornography kind of would fit in with that too, because anything that has the boost as well as the euphoria. What'll happen? So let me explain why this is so important. So back with our fingers coming out as dendrites and our receiver, when we throw in a whole bunch of excess chemicals, okay, in the form of caffeine, for example, the system wants homeostasis. That's the goal of the system, is homeostasis. So in order to find a balance after it's been kind of overloaded with a chemical, there's two options. One is to stop producing its own chemical, similar to what's come into the system. The second option is to create more receptor sites, more places for that chemical to go, so that it doesn't hang out in the synapse. When the chemical is hanging out in the synapse is where you get your high. It's where you get your excess rush or whatever it is that you might get from an excess. So that's your options. Now, what happens then is, let's say you do this enough that the body has adjusted so that you built up tolerance because you have more receptor sites, or your body's not producing enough of its own, and then the supply ceases for some reason. Either you decide you've got to quit or there's no more to be found. That puts you into withdrawals. Okay, so the tolerance builds up because your body is trying to find that homeostasis. And then if you change the system or change what's coming in, then you're going to experience withdrawals. So then you just kind of go in this vicious cycle. To stop the vicious cycle, you've got to pretty much convince your system that it's got to make its own chemicals, and it needs to balance out the receptor sites so that it's in balance. How long does that take? Yes. It depends on what else we do. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of things that'll help balance it out faster. So somewhere between weeks and years. That's pretty broad, but depending on what it is and how many things you do to support the system to find the balance again. Now, it is possible, and this was my challenge, that the balance was never there to begin with. Can some of you relate to that? Because that's what I could relate to growing up. So it took me a while in my recovery myself to figure out what it was that was never in balance to begin with, and it was my endorphin system. I never had enough of that, it seemed. All the work I was doing, it seemed like, wasn't ever really fixing anything because I don't know that I had the balance to begin with. So that's the other thing, is we're going to learn how to create a balance that's never been there. Okay, back to our chart. We're going to go through each of the 5 chemicals separately and talk about different types of solutions for those. So we're going to start with norepinephrine. So norepinephrine, I'm talking about ways to increase energy, motivation, metabolism, and to do it naturally. So the first one I'm going to mention is SAMe. So SAMe is a supplement that supports norepinephrine levels. S-adenosine methionine occurs naturally in the body. Methionine is an amino acid, and SAMe is involved in enzymatic processes. It is sold as a dietary supplement and is purported to improve memory, focus, and concentration, as well as increase energy. There are some reported side effects similar to stimulants such as anxiety or insomnia, but it is more natural and can support the brain more effectively than artificial stimulants. So some experiences I've seen with this is that I have suggested it to people who've been diagnosed ADHD and who have taken medications, and for some reason, personally for them, usually they decided either they're not able to continue the medications or they want to try something more natural. And I have seen success with it. It has been as effective. In fact, some people report that they feel better. A lot of times when someone's working on something natural, they are also taking care of other things in their life physically, making some other changes. But I have seen that it goes along well with a positive health focus and change. So that might be something worth trying. It's not something that I've used personally because my norepinephrine levels tend to be high enough. In fact, I tend to deal with anxiety more than low motivation or low energy. The next thing that I'll mention is an alkaline diet. So an alkaline diet is a pH balanced diet, and I talk more about pH on Balance Your Physiology. But the alkaline diet typically just involves eating foods that are very natural, like you're not going to see any preservatives, anything typically out of a box. And so it's typically very fresh foods, vegetables and fruits, and meats can fit into an alkaline diet. But what you typically see is very few, if any, grains or starches, no sugar, if not low sugar. A lot of times dairy may be taken out into that. But what happens with it is that by raising your pH, you raise your energy, your motivation, your metabolism goes up. You typically have a lot more of the norepinephrine balance. So the other thing people will try, I've tried and I recommend it, and a lot of people have good success with it, is alkaline water. And so that's included in my bonus class on hydration. We'll talk a little bit about the best waters I found for that. But if you're familiar with alkaline water, it's usually a pH of over 8, sometimes 8.5 or maybe even 9. There is a downside to becoming too alkaline, and so that will be addressed in the next classes. But it is a way to kind of compensate for an acidic state, which can happen when you have too much sugar. So, and it can give you a little bit of a boost as well. And then intense exercise. So this is where a lot of times you'll hear, that you're supposed to exercise to get the good chemicals flowing. And there's different types of exercise, but I would definitely say that the high intensity exercise is going to raise your norepinephrine. Your adrenaline comes up. So noradrenaline and norepinephrine are used interchangeably. And so anything that increases your adrenaline is typically also raising your norepinephrine levels. High energy music And music can actually be used for all of the chemicals, but I happen to mention it here, and I do go into it a little bit more in the chapter on sensory engagement. But high energy music can stimulate all of those chemicals that you're trying to get physically, and it's really the power of the mind and just response to that emotion, and a lot of times it will drive a person to get moving, so that's part of it too, I think. And then I'll just throw in a couple of other things that weren't on the chart. Decreasing sleep by an hour roughly. You don't want to decrease it too much, but if you're somebody who gets 8 or 9 hours of sleep, you could try getting 7 or 8 hours of sleep instead. And I typically recommend that you would get up an hour earlier rather than go to bed later. So it's just interesting how getting up earlier and getting yourself moving sooner in the day sometimes will get that norepinephrine moving. It works with the cycles, and we'll talk more about schedules and how the brain chemicals work on a cycle in a later class, in a bonus class. And then this one I thought I'll throw in here because I've been using this lately, but it's use power statements aloud with strong posture. And some people are familiar with declarations. And declarations are powerful in that they work with the mind, but if you do it with your body, so you're verbally expressing these power statements, and your body is holding a power stature, then it's amazing. It will tell you, your body, your brain, your subconscious, you're ready to wake up, or you're ready to get going, or, it charges you. So it's amazing how that can work. And I recommend doing that first thing in the morning. And then, it's better than a cup of coffee, I tell you. Okay, let's go into GABA. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. And something to note is that when you increase your norepinephrine, you're typically decreasing your GABA, or that's one way to, it's kind of like there's a teeter-totter there with norepinephrine on one side and GABA on the other. And a lot of times when you're trying to decrease norepinephrine, you want to increase your GABA. So just something to keep in mind when you're creating a balance, that these two are part of the balancing act. So the first thing I'm mentioning is Benadryl. And so this is because it's kind of on the edge of, natural and not. It is the safest, least addictive type of medication that I am aware of. And I found it's preferable to most sleep aids. So I actually have recommended it to quite a few people, and I used it myself for about 3 years straight every night. I recommend taking it about 10 hours before you need to wake up or be fully awake. And what it can do is it can help shift a pattern of insomnia or a night owl kind of pattern by taking it, kind of strategically saying, I want to be able to sleep by 10, and then taking it maybe about 9 o'clock and knowing that you don't have to get up until 7. That would be a really good routine. And so what I found is that I was taking it that was about my routine, and it allowed me to get up earlier because I was sleeping earlier. And the other thing is that it's not really a full rebound, but it does kind of when it's worn off or out of your system, you do tend to kind of come back up into the norepinephrine or the opposite side of that GABA. So I found it's very useful, and you can take anywhere from about a half a dose to the full dose, which is I think 2 pills. I guess even a half a pill, so a quarter dose, depending on how sensitive you are to it and how much you really need. It is safe enough that pregnant women are, allowed to take it. It's used in infants and children, so it's quite safe. And I did find it was not addictive at all when, after 3 years of taking this, when I decided, all right, I'm going to see what happens without it, I just went cold turkey off of it, and it didn't really faze me. I think over a week or two, I noticed my peak in energy came back at night, which was the problem. And so you can use other tools to manage that as well. But GABA is one. So GABA is actually sold as a supplement. And you can take it any time. What I found is that Benadryl is pretty powerful. And so if I took it at 10 o'clock and my daughter called me at 11 saying she needed a ride home from a party or whatever, I would say probably not. You'll have to have somebody else come get you because it is pretty powerful. But if I had taken GABA, I would be fine, because what will happen with GABA is your own chemistry can override it, whereas with something like Benadryl or a sleeping pill, you're not able to do that. And then I like to mention potassium here because GABA works through the potassium channels in the brain, and that's mentioned in my book. But it's one of the minerals that is facilitating the GABA getting across the synapse. And it's one of the most important one for GABA. So I recommend potassium, and I'll talk more about minerals in some later classes. Yoga, there's actually research that has found that yoga specifically increases GABA levels. There is certain types of yoga, and so there's a calming type yoga or a slower yoga, whereas like vinyasa probably wouldn't increase GABA levels, but certain types of yoga will do that. And I've done those types of yoga with some quiet music at night, and that has replaced the Benadryl for me. Deep breathing is another great tool, and I discuss that more in sensory engagement because you can actually use breathing to also stimulate your system. I will mention that it's the exhale that is the key in the part of the breathing that's calming, and I explain that more later. And then meditation is the powerful practice that I have found calms the nervous system. It allows the brain to kind of reset. Many good things come from meditation. There's lots of research on that right now, and it's becoming more common. But I have found that it's a way to balance in general without ending up too far in one extreme or the other. It's a very powerful balancing tool. Okay, let's talk about serotonin. So serotonin is a fairly common chemical people have heard of lots. So what people maybe haven't heard of so much is 5-HTP. So 5-HTP is an actual metabolite of serotonin. So it is available as a supplement as well. And CalMag Fizz is one of my favorite supplements. It is a powder or just mixes with water, and you can just drink that. So it's not like taking a pill. But it provides a balance of calcium and magnesium with the addition of some B vitamins and other nutrients, and it supports the gut to relax, and it really enhances serotonin. And if you've noticed in the book, it talks about how serotonin is pretty much formed in the gut. That's where we get more of our serotonin. It's actually not formed in the brain. So we need, a lot of times we need the gut to be happy and relaxed and have all of the nutrients it needs to be able to work with that serotonin to get it all the way through the bloodstream and where we want it. So mindful eating is another tool, and I talk about that more in sensory engagement, but eating is another factor where eating involves the gut, and we've talked about how a lot of times people who are craving serotonin are just craving food. You know, a lot of times they're overeating maybe, or they're overdoing it with carbs. And so if you go into a mindful eating practice, a lot of times you get away from the mindset that goes along with that, and you can be a little more careful and conscious of how food's working for you and not working for you. Getting into your emotional state and really feeling your emotions a lot of times is a solution. I do find it interesting that people on antidepressants find that has shut down their emotions. And so really to get their balance back, they're having to get rid of the antidepressants and start feeling their feelings again. And then they naturally find the balance, which is cool. So the mind is also important in that picture. And positive affirmations can be a great tool for increasing your sense of well-being and improving your mood. And we're going on to beta endorphins. So beta endorphins are tricky because they, if you remember correctly, they are very addictive. So it is tricky to get them in balance without engaging in something that could be highly addictive. So here are some ideas. A high protein diet is probably the number one suggestion, because amino acids are the building blocks for your neurotransmitters. And like we mentioned, 5-HTP was a metabolite. The amino acid of 5-HTP is L-tryptophan, and pretty much all the neurotransmitters are going to have specific amino acids that help to build them. But if you have enough protein in general, you're going to have those building blocks. Plus, sugar imbalance is often part of the problem with an imbalance in beta endorphins. And so if you have enough protein in your system, you're also balancing your sugar. It's a little harder to get a sugar high, for example, when you have a lot of protein. And sometimes people instinctively want more protein so that they have that balance. But one way that you could keep that balance is to just maintain your protein levels. And it's recommended that you would eat maybe protein every 4 hours. All right, vitamin D is another solution. And this just helps with the general happy, feel good. It's subtle, I think, how vitamin D tends to influence the beta endorphins. Because I have mentioned a little bit when people are in a dysthymic pattern or a seasonal affective depression, I think a lot of times it's those endorphins that are low, and it's also the vitamin D that's low. So experience sun if possible, because that's where we get it. If you're not going to get enough from the sun, try a supplement, and that's helpful especially in the winter and rainy season. So when the clouds are in the sky, you might want to consider, might be a vitamin D day. And theta waves. So I talked about that further in the bonus content and the chapter on sleep cycles. It is one of the brainwave patterns, and the theta state, it is an amazing place to hang out. I have found that when you can find that state through meditation or massage, like I mentioned here, it is almost blissful. So there's a little bit of a euphoria there, but it's not stimulating. It's very calming. And then spiritual highs is also a way to get beta endorphins. So this is like a real solution. And, when I talk about real solutions, I save some of the best for last. And so in the last chapter of the book and the final e-course, I talk about some amazing spiritual fulfillment kinds of practices and processes that allow you to feel complete and fulfilled and really have no need for a fix or anything on the outside to create that. And then dopamine. So dopamine I've mentioned a little bit. Dopamine, you got to be careful with trying to keep that in balance and not get too much of it because it's addictive as well. And some antidepressants, I do want to mention this, contain SNRIs, or they're actually called SNRIs instead of SSRIs. So what that stands for is serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And they tend to increase dopamine levels. So that is an option for people who do have a chemical imbalance, and it makes sense for them to maybe look at a medical route. Just know that not all antidepressants are the same. And if your dopamine's low, you may want to look at an SNRI rather than an SSRI. But if you're looking for natural solutions, D-L-phenylalanine is a good one. Let me actually explain that one. D-L-phenylalanine is the amino acid that supports dopamine. So D-phenylalanine will be the precursor for beta endorphins, and L-phenylalanine is the precursor for norepinephrine. And so together, I think that's interesting, they tend to support the dopamine more. It is kind of tricky. I haven't had a great deal of success in just supplementing with D-L-phenylalanine, but I have seen a lot of good results when it's combined with other amino acid formulas. And one of those is Q96. So Q96 does include D-L-phenylalanine along with minerals and L-glutamine. So it has a nice balance of different things, and it is being researched and has a lot of success in managing depression and other mood disorders. So something to look at for sure. And muscle test that along with Zango. Zango has been around for a while. I actually use Zango in the winters for several years, and I found that it tastes great. It's I was good with as little as 2 ounces. They suggest, I think, 4 ounces per day. But just that much of the Zango can improve depression symptoms, and you can really feel a lift in mood with that. And it's a fruit juice. It's pretty simple, but it comes from the mangosteen plant or fruit, and it is effective. Engaging your senses is a good solution with dopamine. So when I mentioned before, when you're low in dopamine, a lot of times you struggle with boredom. And so a lot of times when people are struggling with boredom, they depend on other things to engage them in their senses, like video games, for example. And if you can get away from that and really just engage your senses in life and find a passion for life, that's going to be the balance you want. That's not going to be, that's not going to have a downside. And vivid mindfulness And so NLP goes right along with that, is that you're actually working with your brain like it's a computer. And so instead of depending on your computers, you're actually, there's a counterfeit. Computers are kind of counterfeits for the power we have in our own mind and our sensory connections to really engage and to create things as far as creativity projects and a vision for our lives. And so if you're doing that, a lot of times you don't need more dopamine. So that was kind of a quick summary on the 5 different chemicals and ways to increase those naturally. So you'll want to go back to the chart. You also may want to look through the resources list. And just using that resources list, a lot of times you can get some ideas and start muscle testing and researching on your own some things that might be useful for you. And so just use that, your own intuition and your innate knowing, and start kind of following a path and try things. And I do recommend people try one thing and give that a week or 2. It's called controlling for variables. And so you want to just have one new variable at a time if possible, so that you can see how it's going to work for you and kind of gauge the pros and cons with that. And then go from there. And so develop routines. And I also mentioned that you want to be able to have a routine with whatever it is that is looking like it's a good option, and stick with it so that you can allow it to work for you. And the thing about natural solutions is usually you just stick with it as long as your body needs to incorporate it and to make its adjustments. And then a lot of times you can be done. And so like I mentioned, with my situations, I did a lot of these things for a few years, for example, and then my body adjusted and it was ready for the next level. And my health and my well-being have gradually improved, and my experience has improved over time. And so now the solutions I'm looking for are either simpler, or they take less time, sometimes less money, which is nice, and they're working better. So that's always nice. So I wish you well on finding your solutions. And so your assignment for this week would be to kind of make your own personal list of the things that you feel are right for you, or that you must still test positive on, and then take those steps towards trying those and track kind of how you're doing and be consistent with it.